Welcome to Shakti Punch. Namaste. I'm your host Pranav. On this show, we go together hand in hand on a cosmic voyage to unravel the mysteries of reality through a Dharmic Indic perspective. We're talking reality, divinity, praxis. We're doing it all. Time on the clock is 426,875 years, 118 days, 2 hours, blah, blah, blah minutes on the Kali Yuga clock. You know what it is. The ball's going to drop. Here with my co-host as ever, Adi Parige. Thank you, Adi, for joining me. Guys, remember, we do have a Patreon. We would love if you could contribute something into the hundi. We have a $1.08 tier. We would love if everybody who listens to this podcast just contributed $1 a month. Really, it's $1.08 a month. It really helps us with our production, keep the production value going, helps us with our bandwidth in general. And there's multiple tiers that you can contribute to, so we hope you will. And if not, just subscribe here, share with your friends, comment, like, all the normal YouTube-y stuff. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, I want to start by talking about something a little bit unusual that might seem unusual at the top. I've been rewatching The Sopranos.
Hell yeah.
Lately. The Sopranos, if you haven't watched it, if it's people in India watching it or people here, you should watch The Sopranos. It's just an incredible show. Yeah. Right? And I realize all narrative shows are actually very dharmic in a sense, because good narrative shows are always about transformations.
Yep.
Right? And that's really baked into everything that we're talking about in terms of Dharma, Dharmic praxis in general. But I want to talk about The Sopranos, and I want to talk specifically, The Sopranos is sort of like it's a very dharmic tale in a sense. Or it's a very adharmic tale, but it's actually like, I think of it as a sort of the Rakshasa Dharma, right? Yeah. The Dharma of a Rakshas, right? Which is Tony Soprano, a gangster, the mob boss of northern New Jersey, right? And to me, it's a very striking sort of dharmic story in that, first of all, it begins just like the Yoga Vasishta, just like the Bhagavad Gita, just like so many Hindu texts. It begins with an existential crisis from the hero, right? Yeah. Arjuna doesn't want to fight on the battlefield. Lord Rama is in a state of disillusionment and dejection about the world, right? And Tony Soprano, at the very beginning of The Sopranos, it's the exact same thing. And what is he doing? He's going to talk to a psychiatrist, right? Dr. Jennifer Melfi. And as we all know, psychiatry is just bootleg dharmic thinking. Anyway, that's just a joke, but it is. And we'll get into that a little bit later, right? And it's very interesting because even the structure of it is very similar in that he's experiencing this existential crisis within him right on the cusp of achieving power and becoming the boss of northern New Jersey. And right on the cusp of this, Tony is experiencing panic attack. My hair is on end, my hair is standing on end, my mouth is parched. Think about all the things Arjuna says right on the cusp. And that's kind of him experiencing a panic attack, right? Sure. Likewise, Tony Soprano is experiencing panic attacks. And why? Well, first of all, there's multiple reasons, right? But the first thing is that he has a conflict with his family. In order to achieve, right, his dharma, right, as the mob boss of New Jersey, in order to be the proper gangster, he is in conflict with his family, first of all. His uncle, who is his rival to be the boss of northern New Jersey mob, right? He's a sort of mini boss that he has to face. And then, of course, the big boss, which is his mother. Yeah. Similar to Arjuna. Arjuna loves his family. He doesn't want to have to fight his family, but he has to fight his family for the sake of dharma. Tony Soprano has to do this basically for the sake of his adharmic dharma, in a sense, right? Or his rakshasa dharma, as we're calling it here. And this is a consistent theme throughout the show, right? Is Tony is always having to, in order to exercise his duty, his dharma as a Rakshasa, he has to kill multiple people, right? He has to kill his best friend, Big Pussy Bumpin' Sarah, right? And then he has to kill Jackie Jr., the son of his best friend, who he feels affection and love for. And then he has
Spoiler alert,
right? And then he has to kill his cousin, Tony Blundetto, right? In order to keep his mob family together and keep it functioning properly. And to me, that's identical to the dilemma of Arjuna, but it just happens to be for something adharmic. That's why I say this is a Rakshasa's dharma that we're exploring here. And it's also at the same time, it's a dharmic cautionary tale, right? And that this is a life that of a person who, like a Rakshasa, holds too dearly to materiality, right?
Yeah.
He's obsessed with materiality. His whole life revolves around sensual experiences, right? And this, as we know, is the persistent cause of suffering for all beings, right? Is this attachment to the materiality, this nescience, right? This veiling of the ultimate reality of Satchitananda, right? Of Parabrahman, of the ultimate reality. And for him, his whole life, he's following his dick everywhere. Like, let's just be real about it. That's what Tony Soprano does. He follows his dick everywhere. As a result, he's always landing himself into troubles, right? Whether it's in his home life with his family or in his life as a mob boss, various affairs that he's having lead him to make bad business decisions and things like that. His ego, his hubris, all of these things. Think about Ravana, and this is sort of like, if there was a Bhagavad Gita for Ravana, right, it would be the Sopranos in a way. Right. And so his life is completely dedicated to the sensual. And things come to to me, there's a real tipping point towards the end of the show in season 6. Things really come to a sort of dharmic head when Tony is shot by his uncle, who himself is in a state of dementia, and then he goes into a coma. And then something really remarkable happens. And this is straight out of the Yoga Vashishta. We talked earlier in previous episodes about the story of Lila. A little rewind. Story of Lila is when Vashishta is narrating the story of this woman named Lila, who was a queen and wants immortality, and is then led on a cosmic voyage by Goddess Saraswati to understand that human beings and jivas exist on multiple timelines of reality, right? Multiple incarnations that are all projections of the self, and these are all illusory, actually, right? And through the astral body, she's able to travel and see all the multiple versions of Lila, the half a dozen or so versions of Lila that exist, that are all actually rooted in, one sage's meditations and desires, right? In a very humble little hut somewhere, right? And Tony experiences this exact same thing. He experiences something very similar, I should say, rather. He experiences his own story of Lila. Hey, Lila, I'm experiencing the story of Lila over here. And it's really amazing because Tony in his coma experiences his jiva in a different timeline. And in this other timeline, he's actually just an upstanding salesman, right? And he's a family man, and he doesn't have his New Jersey accent or anything, right? But we don't know his name. But you get the sense that this is who Tony wishes he could be, in a sense, right? Because he's not. The alternate version of him also wishes the opposite, right? Because in this version, he has like a nice, placid home life, and things are kind of nice. But he's still a very successful person, right, as a salesman. But in this other timeline that he's experiencing of himself, he like tries to have an affair, but his conscience won't let him, right? And there's things like that are happening. So it's funny. There's two oppositional things that are happening. This version of him almost wishes he could be a Tony Soprano type of being sort of adharmic and having the affair and living just by his impulses, while Tony, in some sense, yearns to live as somebody who is able to restrain the impulses, right? And it's amazing because he then also, on top of that, as this other alternate Tony, he's at this convention and he's like, hey, somebody left their briefcase in my room. It's some guy named Kevin Finnerty. Looks a lot like me too, but it's not me, obviously. I'm whoever I am. They don't say who he is. Yeah. But what we're seeing here is yet another potential jiva of Tony Soprano, right? Another possible projection of his consciousness, right? Of his individual jiva. And he's carrying around now this briefcase and this idea of this guy named Kevin Finnerty. And he doesn't know who this guy is, but he gradually starts merging into the identity of Kevin Finnerty. Yeah. Right. And and to the point where everyone's like, you're Kevin Finnerty now. Right. And there's a point where, and it's very telling. I feel like they were reading Buddhist texts or maybe Yoga Vashishta or something like that when they were writing this episode. The show in general does have a slight obsession with Buddhism in general. I think so. They talk about it in previous episodes. He's having an affair with a Buddhist chick and this and that and the other thing.
Tangentially, but Michael Imperioli is like went and studied Buddhism quite deeply. I think,
yes, he did. Yeah. Yes, he did. And so he's now merging now into this identity of a Kevin Finnerty as well. So now we have 3 different versions of Tony Soprano. There's Tony, then there's the nameless Tony, and now there's Kevin Finnerty, whose briefcase and baggage, literal baggage, he is now carrying, right? And then, he's at the gate of his final transformation, which is the Finnerty family reunion that he's supposed to go into. And there's many ways you can interpret this scene in The Sopranos. But he sees his cousin that he had just recently killed is there outside this thing. He's like, hey, do you want to come on in? And he's like, yeah, maybe. He's like, well, you got to leave your baggage here. You got to leave all your stuff here. There's no briefcases allowed in here. And Tony's like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to stay. And that's the moment that he comes out of the coma.
Yeah.
To me, that's dharmic as shit, That's dharmic as hell. And I think there's a lot more unpacking that can go on in that, but these were just kind of my initial mental scribblings as I was watching this episode of The Sopranos. There's 2 episodes of The Sopranos. I think it's episode 67 and 68, if anybody is interested. But to me, this is just the story of Lila, right? In another kind of form with some modifications there. But this is purely the story of Lila that's happening, multiple timelines, and I think that's fascinating. I just wanted to share that. It was just so striking to me.
I think if you look at a lot of gangster movies as well, they all deal with questions of dharma even if they don't know that they are. It's kind of just like implanted in the condition of gangster films.
It is. And it's always like a Rakshasa's dharma though, right? Because
Totally.
there's always actually, their struggle is actually, hey, how do I have the guts to do what's wrong? You know what I mean? Because there's always the tension between their family, their actual family, and then their mafia family.
Yeah.
Right? That's a very persistent theme.
Yeah.
So I think gangster movies are a good, because, these are...
Whether it's adharmic or dharmic is interesting to me though. Because you could say, like we've talked about this maybe last two episodes ago, like Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu were kind of sent to live out that dharma.
Right.
Right?
You're right.
And like being bad, it's kind of like how no one is really bad or good. People always see themselves as being righteous, sort of, in their actions.
Or they're living, and I think the key thing is that they're living according to their essence.
Yes.
Right? And what is his essence? He's a gangster. Thus, he must just be a gangster.
I think that, and that is kind of how it ends too, right? He chooses just the end of the Lila episode.
Yeah.
He chooses to go back to Tony.
He chooses to go back to Tony. That's actually his dharma. And I think that's a great point, actually. To say it's adharmic is maybe not actually the correct way of phrasing it.
Yeah, I think it's like, and I think this is the I haven't read enough of like the Ashtavakra Gita. It's something I'm looking into right now because I want to, but something that struck me just from like reading about it was that it's like, it steps away from morality and right or wrong, which is, the Gita and then the Ramayana, for instance, are both they have different takes on morality.
Yes.
But it's morality driven nonetheless.
Yeah. I mean, the Ramayana is a tale of somebody who is the perfect moral being, the perfectly dharmic being, which is Lord Rama. He's the perfect man. And that's what we're doing. The Mahabharata, though, is about the conflicts in terms of pursuing dharma,
100%.
right? In the pursuit of dharma, which is why people love the Mahabharata more in many ways. It's a much more interesting story in many ways. Although, don't sleep on the Valmiki Ramayana. It is a wild...
I need to get into that.
Wild ride. I love it. It's so good. Everything in the Sundarkand is just pure gold. Actually, throughout it all, it's like pretty gold, There's a lot of repetition and stuff. And he went to this ashram, and he went to this ashram, and he went to this ashram, and so on. But great read nonetheless. But yeah, Tony's a gangster and he's living his gangster's dharma. That's what it is. Because we all are here in Maya, right? Even in the Yoga Vishishta, it's like, don't abandon what you do in this life. The point is to do it with a sense of renunciation, and that's how you liberate yourself from further births.
Right.
So if you're a gangster, that's your role apparently in this Maya, right? This Maya Lila, I guess we can call it.
I think so. Yeah.
Tony Soprano, Dharmic AF. Who knew? Who knew? Who knew? Hey, I'm achieving moksha over here.
And next week we talk about, does Walter White fall off his dharmic path?
Well, it's like the thing is like it feels adharmic because these guys, especially the gangsters, they're it's all the ahamkara that's driving them, right? Whereas the morals, the actual lesson of the Gita and the lesson of all these things is no, you detach from your ahamkara and you just do your duty. Like. Yeah, it's very complicated stuff, right? We're not going to unpack all that now. Let's get back into the Yoga Vishishta.
Let's do it.
If we can. Today I want to talk about the science of transmigration a little bit. And so just to recap, we know that liberation comes from the cessation of the mind, right? Achieving that state of no mind, samadhi, nirvikalpa, right? And the cessation comes from pranayama is one way. We know that Busunda, the crow, taught us about this, right? About the benefits of pranayama. But it also comes from the cessation of thoughts through self-inquiry. And at the end point of both those is the same result, the realization of Brahman, right? The experience of Satchitananda. And we know from previous episodes that prana and thinking, they're locked in a vicious circle of interdependence, right? Where prana goes, thought follows. And where thought goes, prana follows as well, right? And it's a chaotic kind of relationship. It's a sort of toxic relationship.
Sounds sort of yin-yangy.
It is a little bit.
Yeah.
It is a little bit. And this is why we're taught that pranayama and samkhya both are recommended for liberation. At one point, Vishishta tells Rama there's two kinds of yogis. There's the Samkhya yogi who sits in self-contemplation, right, and achieves it that way through rational analysis and inquiry into the nature of reality, right? And then you come down to this subatomic state, which is the Brahma particle, right? The Brahman particle, right? And then the other thing is pranayama. That's an activity that you do. And he calls one of them is the Samkhya yogi who does the contemplation. Then the other one is what he calls the yoga yogi. And that's the one who does the pranayama, right? And without either of these, though, your jiva is doomed to reincarnation, right? Because the end point of both of these is the cessation of thought, the cessation of prana, right? The quiescence of prana, the quiescence of the mind, achievement of samadhi. And without these, you are subject to reincarnation. And so I think it's interesting for us to talk about, well, how does reincarnation actually work, right? Well, in order to talk about this, we have to talk about the vasanas. What are the vasanas? We've talked about the vasanas before, but before we called them latent tendencies, right? And these are the things that Vishishta tells us that we have to, through self-effort, overcome our latent tendencies in order to achieve liberation, right? But what are vasanas specifically? Vasanas are psychological conditioning. That is what it is. That's what we're deconditioning ourselves from. This is psychological conditioning. It's past impressions, memory, latent tendencies that make you who you are, right? And these latent tendencies exist because of the delusion that this world is real, right? And everything then that from that comes the gradual thickening of Maya, right? Of the illusion, of the delusion, right? It becomes thicker and thicker and thicker, this forgetfulness of infinite consciousness. And so what happens that when you die, as prana, the life force leaves the body, it takes with it and crystallizes these vasanas. These vasanas begin to crystallize once you are leaving this specific jiva that you're in, right? And these vasanas that constitute what the shape of your jiva is in the next life. And it's only as they leave your corporal fleshy body that they crystallize. Why? Because the body, when you're in this specific jiva, you are eligible to try to decondition yourself. But the minute the body is given up, the body is quit, now it's just your prana, and your prana is now taking with you all those vasanas, that psychological conditioning, and it crystallizes, and that crystallization is what determines the shape of your next jiva, of your next incarnation. And you're consigned to that in your next birth. That's what it is. So your birth now is determined by your vasanas of your previous birth, the psychological conditioning in a sense, right? And I wanted to talk about this because this is a fascinating connection between psychology, psychoanalysis, and metaphysics, right? That we see here, that's happening in Dharmic thinking, in Advaita thought specifically here, right? In traditional Western psychology, it's interesting because the same process is happening of trying to decondition the self. That's what you're doing, right? You're trying to process traumas, get rid of memories, essentially. You're trying to wipe the slate clean so you can live in a blissful state. It's the dispelling of vasanas that's happening, right? But modern psychology and modern psychoanalysis, I think, is very limited by materiality, right? A psychoanalyst who tells their patient, hey, listen, you need to stop being a pedophile or whatever, right? Stop diddling kids. And if they were to tell them, hey, if you don't stop diddling kids, you're going to end up being a molested kid in your next life or something. I don't know if that's a good metaphor, right? But it's like for them to present to them the cosmic compensatory movement of the cosmos in terms of karma, right? They would lose their license. You know what I mean? Yeah. If they start talking to them in terms of these are your karmas and this is actually going to follow you into your next life, you're going to be trapped in a cycle of birth and rebirth, they could possibly lose their license over something like that. I don't know, maybe not. But what we see in Dharmic thought, though, is a keen interest in psychology, in psychoanalysis, actually. It's an interest in psychology and the various millstones of the mind as something which doesn't simply drag you down in this life, but on a much greater cosmic scale of liberation or lack of liberation. And I feel like this is always going to be the limit of modern psychology and modern psychoanalysis because, look, what we see is there's people who just get kind of trapped in therapy, You know what I mean? There's people who get trapped in therapy, and modern therapy specifically is just becoming another figment of Maya. It's just a densening of it, a thickening of it, because so many therapists now are just telling people to be like, oh, you just have to accept who you are, and that's who you are. And they don't want to dispute too much. They don't want to present a challenge for their patients very often, right? Because they need to keep them coming back and make money off of it, right? You want to make your tips, you know what I mean? And that's what I think is a pitfall of modern therapy, and not completely or in its entirety. Believe me, there's a lot of great therapists and analysts out there for sure. But what we do see among people in general, and this yearning for psychoanalysis by people, this yearning for therapy and this need for therapy is that, look, people are itching. They're yearning for something. Right. And they're not getting it from whatever religion that they were raised in. Right. And they're taught that religion is bad and this and that is bad. So they go to a therapist. But even in therapy, I think there's a lot of good that happens in talk therapy, but it's never really giving them a satisfying answer. Right. Because it stays on the level of materiality. It doesn't ever. It very rarely talks about liberation in a grander sense. And I think that's what's missing. And I think that's why this kind of dharmic thinking can be very helpful. The practices that are involved, things like pranayama, things like meditation, you get into the practices of tantra. These are all things that are there to decondition the self, right? Successive processes that lead you to liberation and a perfect deconditioning of the self, right? Which doesn't just end in this life. It may continue into the next life, right? But the process is continuous. And I think to me, that's a healthy and positive way of perceiving what we're doing here, right? I don't know. Just some thoughts that I'm having. Where are we at on time?
22.
Cool. What are you thinking about this, Adi? Does this make sense? Am I being too harsh on Western psychoanalysis and Western psychotherapy?
I can't speak on Western psychotherapy because as much as my girlfriend wants me to go, I haven't gone. I will eventually. But I like Western science because it's very empirical. Mm-hmm. Empirically driven. Yes. Right. But I love Eastern philosophy as well because it gets into the regions that no one else was brave enough to
they
find.
go where eagles dare.
Yeah. So this is like the interesting contention when you try to bring them together.
Yeah.
Right. Which is that like Western science can only go so far because they're looking at everything empirically.
Yes.
Whereas, I don't know, it's kind of like what you were saying on the last episode, like, sometimes you got to read one story to realize that story ain't shit, but you wouldn't be where you are without having learned that story.
Right. And I think the wisdom of the rishis comes from introspection and intuition, right? But it's not just that, right? They were also looking at the world around them too,
they're artists,
right?
like
they're
you were
artists,
saying.
Right?
They're artists.
And
So that's what's kind of missing because there's an element of artistry required of the receiver and of the giver of that to be able to kind of imagine or use I want to use the word imagination because it is linked to that, but like to be able to even perceive or imagine what a next life or talking about something like that is, right? Yeah. But Western science it can't go down that road because it won't be Western science anymore. So it's an interesting relationship.
It's not bound by the rules of Western science, but it doesn't reject the methodologies of it either, right? There is a level of empiricism too, right? That occurs here. And you see that play out because you see the benefits of doing pranayama, right?
Absolutely.
The proof is in the pudding there, right?
Yeah.
You do see instances, there have been just so many instances throughout history of people visibly being the incarnation of somebody else and being able to recite off facts from somebody else's life, from somebody else's family, right? And granted, these are things that are anecdotal, right? And that's why it's hard. They don't necessarily always pass the test of Western empirical thinking, right? And look, we can't think about this totally to shit on Western empirical thinking, Western scientific thinking. And this is something that we've been talking about in terms of how do we construct the Dharma of the future? How do we pursue Dharmic Futurism? Is we have to get into the game now. And so many Indians, so many Hindus are STEM obsessed people. They're versed in the natural sciences. We need to start taking those things, applying them, or seeing how they interact with dharmic thinking as we know it, right? Of our
dharmic practice.
In dharmic practice, right? Yeah. How it interacts with sadhana, right? How it validates or invalidates certain things, and how we refine the process to make it more effective, more potent, more transformative, more liberatory.
On the flip side of that, I think also and this is the hard bit. I think that's the easier bit.
Yeah.
The hard bit is getting Western science, regardless of who the player is.
Yeah.
But getting Western science to just allow, because I think so many people don't realize what these scriptures pack because they get lost when they hear a word.
Of course.
That is reincarnation.
Yeah.
They're like, what's your evidence for that?
know.
And it's like, it takes a certain level of, it's not even compartmentalization. It's just, it takes a certain level of understanding to even know how to balance these things, right?
Yeah, I mean, the problem for them is that science has become a religion, right? And
100%.
thus they're actually limiting their sense of inquiry or the spirit of inquiry when they see a word that scares them off. They're like, well, I can't do that. It's the Pied Piper is going to lead me away from, quote, science, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like Christians who are like, don't do yoga. And, you know, there is a validity there, right? It will take you off the path of Christianity, actually, to do yoga. Likewise, with science, Western science, yeah, it might take you into a more spiritual, metaphysical way of engaging reality.
And I think it should be open to engaging with it. It doesn't have to believe it.
Yes.
But like, it should remind itself that Isaac Newton was also an alchemist.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Like there's a history of these two things blending with one another and in pursuit of the same thing, right? Which is truth. Yeah. And I think Western science and Eastern philosophy have done insane amounts of contributions.
Absolutely, dude.
But they need to learn to come together.
They're both ways of knowing. You know,
there's some little Subramaniam out there who's listening to this.
Some little Ramanujan.
Yeah, who's gonna bridge the gap for all of us later.
Exactly. We're looking at you, buddy. Okay, I'm a comedian. He's a filmmaker. Like we're just here to learn. You know, we're waiting for the big guru to come out and bridge this gap for us with some finality. But to me, again, this is Dharmic Futurism. This is what we have to do. And look, we are seeing it on the other side. Like, you know, people are getting mad. I saw another article, and I don't want to keep harping on the appropriation conversation, but somebody else got mad because in Scientific American, they had a headline, which was like, here's how cardiac coherence breathing can help longevity or whatever it was, right? And a bunch of Indians are like, hey, it's called adulam vilam matat bitch. Hey, benchod. Why are these idiots? They're stealing our practice. And I was like, okay, could be annoying. I clicked open the article. It gave due credit to pranayama, to Eastern breathing practices.
Now we're getting into a human problem of people reading headlines and not clicking open the
Exactly.
articles.
It's like people just want to be mad. You know what I mean? And it's like people who are on Twitter too much, and I'm as much guilty of this as anybody.
But you open up the links.
I open up the links.
At least you open up the links.
Because I was like, well, let me just click so I can hate it better, you know? But then I saw it and I was like, no more hatred, you know? Yeah. It's like they do give due credit, but the fact is that they're now doing the hard work, or they're now doing the work of validating certain things through Western empirical science. And there is a value to that. And Indians need to be doing that too. It's not that we don't have our own traditions of science anyway, right? It just operates differently. Operates according to a whole different grammar and vernacular than it does over here. But again, none of this stuff has ever been stuff that's like, okay, done. No more thinking about this, right? And we know that from this book. This is a radical text that is embraced by Hindus far and wide. And it's something that's destroying and laying waste previous conceptions of how we perceive the divine and how we perceive reality and ourselves and the ideas of gods and things like that, right? It cuts the notions of our traditional divinities down quite a notch. You know what I mean? And that's the spirit that we have to continue to pursue this way. Dharma is a science. Okay, that's what Dharmic thinking is, a scientific thinking, right? It is the spirit of inquiry, right? The difference between that and Western science is that it's about us looking within. Yeah, it's about contemplation and meditation, and those are get in the game, guys. Get in the game. Stop whining. I think that's a good place to stop. Stop whining.
Stop whining.
Stop whining. Hit that subscribe button below. Make a comment, even if you want to be a hater, but preferably a lover. Comment, share, subscribe. Help us proliferate the Dharma, proliferate the message of Dharmic Futurism. We're reinforcing Dharma here, whether you believe in what we're saying or not. Tell your friends. And also, if you can, we would love if you could contribute to the Patreon. I don't want to harp on this too much. We have very cheap tiers, $1.08, $5.04. Just a little money to put in the hundi. That's all we're asking for. Guys, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Shakti Punch. We love you. We're honored by your presence with us here today. Have a beautiful, blessed day. Om Namah Shivaya.